Welcome to this session, Effective Student Literacy Stations to Maximize Student Learning. I'm Robin Dixon, Pre-K through 5th grade ELA Social Studies Consulting Teacher, and I will be your presenter for this session. Let's begin by reviewing our learning intention and success criteria for this session. Our learning intention is as follows. We are learning to develop effective literacy workstations so students will maximize their learning. And you will be successful when you can list elements of effective workstations and determine how to improve your current classroom literacy stations. Let's begin by thinking about what comes to mind when you think of literacy workstations. You'll see some pictures on the screen. Do any of those prompt your thinking about literacy workstations? Do you see students working independently and working at their stations on skills they've learned? Or do you perhaps feel stressed and do you feel like you're juggling many balls when trying to determine workstations for your students? So take a moment to pause the video. Think about what comes to mind, and when you're ready, hit play and start the video once again. All right, so you took a moment to determine how you felt about your current workstation practice. So let's just take a moment to review what is a workstation. Well, a workstation are areas within the classroom where students can work alone, or in pairs, or in triads. And something that's essential about a workstation is that it's something that students can do independently. It's something that they can do without teacher assistance. Because remember, while students are working on workstations, you're teaching your guided reading group. So we want students to be able to be independent. We also want it to be meaningful and authentic. And it will also be previously taught reading, writing, listening, or word work skills. So these are the basic elements when we're talking workstations and literacy workstations, what we are looking at and what we're thinking of. So as we're working through this presentation, I want you to think about the workstations that you have in your classroom. How do your workstations match to what we're going to look at today? And where do you need to strengthen your workstations? Is it in an area of making it meaningful and authentic? Or is it a place where you say, I need to up the rigor within my writing instruction or my word attack skills? So think about your stations so that you can personalize the workstation presentation to your needs. On the screen, you will see two columns. You'll see one that says literacy workstations, and then you'll see one that says traditional learning centers. So let's take a moment to walk through the differences between a literacy station and what we would think of as traditional centers. So first of all, notice that in a literacy workstation, materials are taught and used in instruction first, and then they're placed in the workstation for independent practice. Often in traditional workstations it was new material, but in a literacy workstation we want this to be independent practice. Another difference that you'll see is that your literacy stations will remain up all year. And we'll talk in just a moment about how to determine what you want your workstations to be for the school year. And we change those materials to fit that workstation based on reading levels, what strategies are we teaching, and topics being taught. And you'll see that in a center, centers were often changed weekly with the units of study for social studies and science, for example. So literacy workstations are more consistent throughout the course of the year. The next item that you'll see, and when we compare, is stations are used for students' meaningful, independent work. And you will see that students go to workstations daily. They're meaningful, whereas centers before were used for finishing their work, for motivation, things like crossword puzzles, etc. So things that were extra but not as integral to instruction. This next point is very crucial for Literacy Workstation, and that is that materials are differentiated. That means that we are understanding where our students are performing and where we need to differentiate. And we know that not all students are at the same reading level. So perhaps it's differentiating the reading material and the work they do with that, or perhaps just differentiating the material, for example. And notice in traditional students, traditional centers rather, all students did the same activities, and there's not much differentiation. So that is a huge difference between what we consider a workstation and a traditional center. And during the literacy workstations, teachers are meeting with guided reading groups while students are working on literacy workstations. And so if you need to take a moment to pause the video and examine this chart further to see the difference between a literacy workstation and what would be considered a traditional learning center, you are more than welcome to do that. So if you need to pause the video for additional reading time and reflection, please do so, and when you are ready, start the presentation. Now let's turn our attention to effective traits of a workstation that are non-negotiable in the Topeka Public Schools. In just a moment, we're going to look at a rubric that the district has that shows the expectations of USD 501 Topeka Public Schools workstations. So let's look at our non-negotiables. Number 1, we want to make sure that we focus on practice and purpose. And this goes along with linking to your teaching. So we want to make sure that we are teaching skills and then practicing those in our literacy workstations. So we want it to be purposeful. So for example, if you're studying main idea and details and you've been working on that skill, that is something that you absolutely want to incorporate in your literacy workstations when students are able to complete that skill at an independent level. The same might apply at the lower grades with phonics and decoding. Once students have learned to effectively read CVC words, that would be part of a literacy station rotation where students would practice that skill independently. We also want to balance the process and the product. So how are students going to show you that they have mastered that skill, and what process are you going to use for students to show that? A differentiation is critical to effective literacy workstations. We should be differentiating based on skill and based on reading level. So what this means is that you are having a variety of a material for each student's reading level, and we'll look in just a moment about how that can be accomplished. And this is important. Keep materials to a minimum. Simplify. We don't need lots of fancy materials. More is not always better. Keep your materials consistent throughout the school year so students know how to use those materials. If you're using a rubric, for example, or a graphic organizer, use that graphic organizer throughout the school year. Not only is that beneficial for students to be able to know how they're going to be assessed, but in grades 3 through 5, those rubrics or those graphic organizers can also be used on the state assessment. So keep it simple. And use novelty. And when you use novelty, this would mean trying one new thing at a time. So we wouldn't want to introduce 5 new workstations in one day. We would want to try one new station at a time at the beginning of the year, for example. So we know the brain likes novelty, but we also know that the brain likes novelty in an organized fashion. So let's look at effective traits of literacy workstations. So think about your own workstations and where do you fall on the continuum of your workstations in literacy during guided reading block being effective. Number 1, effective literacy stations are organized and managed so that students can work successfully and independently. So do you have directions for those stations? Do you have the I can statements? Do you have examples or anchor charts as needed? We want students to be able to go to the center and know what to expect and know what to do without teacher prompting. So are your centers organized? Number 2, effective literacy stations are both motivating and engaging. We want students, again, that goes back to that novelty piece. We want students to enjoy and be motivated by showing us what they've learned and by practicing their skills. So are you doing things that are motivating and engaging? And if you need to increase that, what might that look like? 3, effective literacy stations have a consistent structure throughout the year. And this relates to statement number 1. We don't want to be constantly changing what our stations look like every few weeks. We want them to know what to expect when they get to that station. Because as you're teaching guided reading, that consistent structure will allow students to work independently while allowing you to effectively teach the guided reading table and students that you have at that particular time. They're also aligned with the curriculum. So as you're creating your effective literacy workstations, have you aligned them to the standards and competencies? And have you aligned with what you have taught and are currently teaching? Number 5, effective literacy center activities are based on ongoing assessment. So when students have shown you that they have mastered a skill, for example, if they've mastered main idea in detail, through assessments such as Scantron, Mastery Connect, and so on, is it time to change the material? Is it time to add and change that skill with comprehension, for example? Is it time to move on to a new text type? So make sure that you're using assessment to determine and drive when it is time to change the activity or activities within your centers. They also have a built-in accountability system. So if students are spending time practicing, we want them to know if they practiced effectively or if they've made a mistake, because we don't want students to practice incorrectly. And again, that's the importance of putting out materials and skills that students have shown that they're proficient with because they are practicing independently successfully. So how can students have accountability to know how they are performing on that skill? So when we look at differentiation in literacy workstations, really what this means is how can we vary the task and vary the material? And on the screen you will see a picture of an I can statement, and this one is for fluency, and you'll see the circle, the triangle, and the square. So this is where you're varying the task. Maybe the circle group is reading and taking turns reading with a partner. Your triangle group is finding important ideas and supporting detail, while your group that has the red square is practicing retelling. So that is varying the task. Varying the material might look like this: taking a Newsela article and putting it at different Lexile levels for students at varied reading levels. We're not varying the task, but we're varying the material. So I want you to take a moment and I want you to think about how have you varied the task and material. And when you have paused and thought of an idea of how you can do this or add this into your workstation, you may start the video and proceed to the next slide. So I hope you were able to think about how to differentiate your workstations. This tends to be the hardest place, I think, is to develop differentiated material. But think about how you can vary the task and the material. So I want to share with you the workstation rubric that we have, our literacy workstation rubric for the district. So we're going to take just a moment to look at this rubric, and you will see the following rubric. You will see that it talks about workstation management and workstation tasks, and we'll see beginning, developing, proficient, and advanced. And we want to make sure that our workstations are in the proficient and advanced columns, and you'll notice that it talks about using the I can statements. It talks about that they are not new stations, that the teacher has modeled them. They're meaningful. Students have a way to use this workstation to show what they know. We also see a component about technology. So if you do not have a copy of this rubric and you are needing a copy, please reach out to me and I can email you a copy of this literacy workstation rubric. So let's turn our attention to types of stations that you might have throughout the course of the year. Again, we talked about wanting to be consistent so that students know what to expect as they're working through workstations. So on the screen, you will see examples of various types of workstations that you might consider using throughout the year. You'll see that we have writing, we have word work and word study. That will look different from primary to intermediate. Poetry, buddy reading, spelling, grammar is a great workstation to add. Do you want to have a newspaper station? Comprehension, technology. So think about the types of workstations that you want to use all year long. Do you every day through the rest of the year want a writing station or a grammar station? Because we want to create consistency. So as you look at the screen, and keep in mind that this is just a partial list of the types of workstations. There are many, many more. And should you want information about additional types of workstations, if you look up Debbie Diller, Debbie Diller has many resources out there for types of workstations and how to set those up. One of the things that's not on the list but that you might want to think about in the younger grades, in our primary grades, would be something with a phonics station or a phonemic awareness or phonology station. So you've got to think about your grade level and your purpose for your stations. You'll notice under technology, our district resources are Moby Max, Footsteps to Brilliance, and No Red Ink. And these are all excellent resources to support your literacy workstations. You can use No Red Ink for grammar and writing, for example. It is an excellent resource. And if you want more information on No Red Ink, I also have a presentation that walks you through all the amazing components of No Red Ink, and I would be more than happy to send that to you. So think about the stations that you currently have. Are those the ones that you want to keep for the remainder of the year? Or do you want to make some changes to those before the start of next semester or start of next school year? So let's look at creating stations, because we've now looked at the elements that we need to make sure that our stations have. We've looked at the type of stations that we can create. Now let's look at actually creating stations. So some questions to think about. What skills have students learned in class? Will this assignment or will this station help students to work in their zone of proximal development? Because we want it to be something that not too easy and not too hard. And again, that differentiation will come into place because that zone of proximal development will be different for each student in your classroom. And then you can ask yourself, how are we going to differentiate based on those levels? And do I want consistent stations or changing stations? For example, do you always want to have a word workstation? And when we were talking about changing station, perhaps writing and grammar will be ones that you might do grammar for one quarter and then writing for the other quarter. So when we talk about changing stations, that's what I'm looking at. I'm not looking at throwing all of your stations out and starting over. What are your expectations for the students, and how are you going to communicate those expectations to your students? And how will accountability be included in stations? And how will students show their knowledge and their learning to you and to themselves? And remember, as you're creating stations, remember to align them to instruction. Make sure that it's purposeful practice as well as independent practice. So once you've determined your stations, you've answered those questions, let's look at what it would look like to create stations. On this screen, you'll see an example for comprehension. You'll notice that the comprehension station would be my constant, and my focus right now for that comprehension station would be explicit and implicit text evidence. So now I'm thinking about how can I implement that center with that focus. So here's some ideas that you can think about. So in MobyMax, I can use fiction or nonfiction assignments with a focus on text evidence and differentiate for students' reading levels. If I search MobyMax assignments and I put in text evidence, it will bring up assignments for me. And what's really nice about MobyMax is that I can assign an activity to just one student or to a group of students. So I can differentiate what I am doing with explicit and implicit text evidence. So for example, in a third grade classroom, maybe I have some students that can do that assignment on a fourth grade level. So I'm going to do that. And perhaps I have students that are at the third grade level. In a third grade classroom, I'm going to assign it at a third grade level. And if I have students that are struggling, I could assign it at a second grade level. So there's many ways in MobyMax to differentiate. I can take a Newsela article printed in different Lexile with questions focused on text evidence. So I can think about, I could have the same article on, let's take the history of New Year's Eve. And I can present that article at different Lexiles, and students can be reading the same material but at different reading levels, and so it provides you a way to have students all access the same comprehension material but at individual reading levels. And if I need an accommodation, I could also have them answer those questions or talk about their text evidence by providing oral answers on Seesaw. So I'm also differentiating how students show their knowledge. And finally, I could use a passage from social studies, from a social studies topic, to find text evidence. Perhaps I'm going to give some students a shorter passage and some students a longer passage, so I can differentiate that way. So this is an example of how I could keep a consistent comprehension station but change my focus. So for now, I could be doing explicit and implicit text evidence, and then my comprehension station would stay the same, but my focus could change, for example, to theme. In the example that you see now, you see writing, and you see that the focus is writing a nonfiction piece with details. And of course, at the lower grades, the details will be a smaller amount than it might be with the older students, or it could be the level of detail, a paragraph at the lower grades, perhaps 3 paragraphs at 4th grade, for example. So here's some center ideas for nonfiction writing. I can use Footsteps to Brilliance for my lower grades. I can use No Red Ink for grades 3 through 5. And in No Red Ink, I can use pre-assigned writing topics, or I can create my own. So I could differentiate the topics within No Red Ink and assign them individually as well. In addition, I could provide leveled resources on a topic students have been studying in class. So perhaps they have been studying the plant cycle. And what you're going to do now is have a variety of materials that are about the plant cycle in different reading levels. Perhaps I have passages at a 2nd grade level, 3rd grade level, 5th grade level, and so on, so that students are able to select material based on their reading level. And to differentiate, students can also be given a list of facts to use to write from. I could also differentiate the amount of details. And so if I'm differentiating and I'm giving a list of facts, perhaps a small group of students is working together to create a list of details about the same topic. Students could then take that list and differentiate their writing and choose, 3 to 5 details that they want to choose. So there's lots of ways that I could differentiate within a writing station. Another item that I could do, if we're continuing to look at writing nonfiction with details, some other center ideas are to use a powerful writing tree to help students write individually, using graphic organizers to help students organize their thoughts, and tying that into something that they have been studying in science or social studies. So lots of ways that you could differentiate a topic for all the students in your classroom. So in the lower grades, you may have a phonemic awareness phonics station. So let's say our focus is phoneme segmentation. And when we look at phonemic awareness, we're looking at the sound level. And when we look at phonics, we're putting the letter to the sound. So this could work both ways. So some center ideas for phonemic awareness and phonics and phoneme segmentation. Number one, you could take a Moby Max lesson and you could assign it by need. Perhaps not all your students in the classroom need that assignment or need that skill. So you could assign it to just those who need it. You could also assign some students phoneme segmenting, some students phoneme blending, and so you could differentiate based on the skill. You could also do a phoneme sort. So you could differentiate with longer and more complex words for students who need that. So for example, maybe not sorting by just CVC, but adding in R-controlled vowels and silent E, etc. So differentiating what students are doing by the length of the words that they are using. So these are just some of the ways that you could differentiate, and you could create stations that will be easy to do and will be impactful for your students in your classroom. So I want you to take a moment to pause the video and reflect on what stations have been effective in your classroom, and have they included these elements. So take a moment to pause the video, think about the stations that have been successful in your classroom, and with that also, maybe where do you need to increase the rigor of your workstations or improve those workstations. So go ahead and pause the video, and when you're ready, start the video again and proceed to the next slide by pushing play. Okay, I hope you were able to think of some ideas that you can do to improve those workstations in your classrooms, and that you've also been able to reflect on what successes you have had. Another critical component to literacy workstations are anchor charts. And an anchor chart is simply a visual representation of a skill, strategy, or procedure. And it's also a way to cue and remind your students of what they've been learning. And most importantly, it's a reference tool that they can use at a literacy workstation. So if you're working with main idea and detail, and you're doing explicit and implicit main ideas, for example, perhaps you have an anchor chart that you've created with your students that students can use at that station to help prompt them, if and when needed, about the difference between implicit and explicit. So anchor charts are really tools that we want our students to use to be successful. We also want to make sure that we're keeping our anchor charts relevant and current, and that students are able to access those. And it also reminds students of prior learning and helps them to make connections to new learning. And we want to keep these posted where students can access them during the workstation. Perhaps it's a smaller anchor chart that stays right at the station with the students. Perhaps you have a place in your classroom where you post those, and so students are able to use those. It might be by your guided reading workstation, where students can use those for guided reading, but also use them during workstations so that they can see them during both activities. And again, we use these anchor charts during mini lessons, whole group, small group instruction, because we're using these anchor charts as teaching points. So we want students to be able to use these and see how you use them as well as you modeled. So we don't just put up an anchor chart without having practiced and worked through it with the students, because you're also creating it while you're working with the students. So it's important that you have a visual representation as well. And as students and teachers are using those anchor charts, perhaps you're going to add to them as you are working through new learning that can be added to that anchor chart. So let's look at what an anchor chart examples might look like for reading strategies and skills. On the board, you'll see several ideas of anchor chart ideas: cause and effect, sequencing, how to make connections as you're reading. The example on the screen is about sequencing, and you'll notice that they have the prompts of first, next, and then to help sequence a story. And again, this is not an inclusive list. These are just some examples that you might consider creating anchor charts for students to use during literacy workstations. This is just to get you thinking. If we look at literary elements, I've included some examples on the board that you might consider. And you'll see literary elements examples through text features for nonfiction, as well as for the difference between external and internal character traits. And so if students were struggling about different types of character traits, they would be able to look at this chart and determine, is it external or internal? And what I love about the one on characters is notice that it's not a super fancy. Notice it was done on notebook paper, like on a smaller chart paper. So we can use construction paper, we can use copy paper, you can use the large pads of sticky notes. Anchor charts can go on any kind of paper. And so perhaps this list on the board of literary elements gets you thinking and pondering about ideas of anchor charts that would be helpful for you to create with your students, for your students to use during literacy station time. And as we conclude, here are some final thoughts for today. Number one, what was a good reminder for you to take forward as you design and create your literacy workstations? What was a new piece of learning for you? And what was an aha? What was something that you hadn't thought about before? So I want you to take a moment to pause the video and reflect on those three questions. And once you have thought about what are good reminders, what's a new piece of learning, and what was an aha, you may start the video once again and proceed to the last slide. So go ahead and pause and reflect on those questions. As we come to the end of our presentation, let's review and see if our learning intention and success criteria were met for this session. Our learning intention was to learn to develop effective literacy workstations so students will maximize their learning. Have you learned tips and tricks to more effectively align your literacy workstations to instruction and to maximize what students are learning in your classroom? And are you successful? Can you list elements of effective workstations? And can you determine how to improve current classroom literacy workstations in your classroom? I want to thank you for watching this presentation. Again, I'm Robin Dixon, Pre-K through 5th grade ELA Social Studies consulting teacher. And should you have any further questions or need any additional information on effective literacy workstations, please do not hesitate to reach out to me.